Next question is, how many grams of salt are needed to make 213 grams of salt water that is 28.5% salt by mass? So we can look at this first by thinking about what information is given in the problem. So we're asking about grams, so it's asking grams equals what? We know that's what we're looking for. Are needed to make 213 grams of salt water, so 213 grams of salt water. That is 28.5% salt by mass. So here's where we want to think about the definition of a percentage. Now, we're going to keep this easy, and the simplest way is to say 100 grams for the total solution. We could technically pick anything, but by assuming 100, it makes life much easier. So we have 28.5, that was the percentage that was given, and we're going to put that over 100 because that's what percentage means. Now we have to figure out what the units are and what those are masses of. So it says percent by mass, so that tells us both of these are going to be in grams. And it says it's percent salt by mass. So that tells us this 28.5 grams is of the salt and the 100 grams is of the solution, okay, or actually the salt water. So for every 28.5 grams of salt, we'd have 100 grams of salt water. So now we have a relationship. And again, what type of unit do we want to start our problem with? The simple unit or the compound unit that shows a relationship? Remember, we always want to start with our simple unit. So we start with 213 grams. I'm going to abbreviate that SW for now, so salt water. I know that on the bottom, because both of these units are now in grams, I've got to make sure it's not just grams that matches up, it's the grams of the same substance. So on the bottom, I have to have grams of salt water, and on top I will have grams of salt. So I have 28.5 grams of salt over 100 grams of salt water. Now I can take 213 times 28.5 divided by 100, and I get 60.7 grams of salt. Because notice the grams of salt water cancel with the grams of salt water. What I'm left with is the grams of salt. Again, looking at our relationship and saying, does this answer make sense? 100 grams of salt water had about 30 grams of salt. So if I double the amount of salt water, I'm going to a little more than double the amount of salt here. So my answer is reasonable.